Alrighty, welcome back to A Writer's Mind. I'm your host, Cherie Spinner, and I've been kind of inconsistent about writing, and I was kind of hitting some walls here and there over the last little bit, and just kind of like hitting the end of where I had thought out the immediate next parts of both the karmic and the not karmic stories. And so I was kind of bouncing around a lot, starting one chapter, not knowing where to go, bouncing over to the other story to work on that, and then back and forth, back and forth. So this episode will probably be a tad bit scattered as I go back and forth between a couple of things. So after I had finished the chapters that I talked about in the last episode, I kind of had hit a part on the karmic series that I was like, I don't really know where to go next. And like big picture, I know where it's going, but I wasn't sure where to take the exact next chapter. And one of my main challenges with that one, I think in this one, is that at this part in the story, it's a lot of information. So I'm really trying to find ways to add interest to the information and make sure that it's moving and it's not just a bunch of talking and learning and thinking. And I wasn't sure what to do next with that one. So I kind of put it on hold to just kind of think about it in the background as I was doing other stuff and working on the not karmic. Because as I had been doing those last several chapters on the karmic story, things had been just kind of like buzzing around in the back of my head about what I needed to do with Penelope in the karmic story to figure out how to keep moving her forward and how much information to give the reader in each chapter to keep the pacing up, because I don't want there to be, obviously any long, boring sections that nobody wants to read, but just keeping the suspense at a good level so that I can kind of bring it up and then back down at the appropriate times and not have these sustained periods of either like too much tension where it feels like something's going to happen, and then it's not. Like you just keep like it's any minute now. So trying to find that balance, which I think is hard with things that are really like suspenseful or dramatic in this case, because there's not really necessarily a big mystery in the not karmic side of things. But I am trying to build a lot of tension toward the ultimate outcome and confrontation. But, unlike what you learn in school where it shows you, the little like roller coaster, or some of my students call it the witch's hat diagram, where it's like, exposition, conflict, rising action up to the climax. Like it doesn't go like that. It's got to go up and down and, have some variation to maintain reader interest. And so that's kind of where I'm at with both of these stories, is figuring out how to keep that rising action section interesting and keep the tension, the mystery going in both without, having too many long sections of just learning or investigating, but not quite finding what they're looking for. So the not karmic one was in the back of my mind, and I kind of went back through a few of those chapters just to see like what were some of the things that I had dropped hints on and had put in place, but I hadn't really circled back around to yet. And one of the first thing was, as I kind of like skimmed back through the early chapters, was I'd had that chapter where it's the first time the reader sees Penelope in the school environment, and we meet Mrs. Harbour, and we see that, she's going to be someone that's a potential person to trust and seek help from. And then she has kind of this verbal, I wouldn't necessarily say altercation because that's a little bit too aggressive, but she has this interaction with the other student named Seville, who comes in late and then is nasty to her, and she's just kind of like, whatever, like, get your work done. And so I had kind of planted that seed that there was this character, Seville, who is just one of those, you're just like, ugh, every time she comes around. And I had ended that chapter, or close to the end of that chapter, where Penelope sends a text. I don't identify who the text is to, or who, she's responding to a previous text. There's no identification of who that is. But the original text that she's responding to kind of was asking basically who's next? And Penelope replies with the student's name, Seville Johnson. And I kind of just left it at that, and we moved on, but kind of bringing that in, that there was something with the student that we're going to come back to later. And honestly, it had, it was still in my head because this is part of the story later on, but in in between chapter 2 and getting up to chapter 8, I had kind of forgotten about that. So it was helpful to go back and skim back through, because I was like, oh, yes, I need to come back to that. And I felt like that had been a long enough, like I planted the seed. I almost want the reader to kind of almost forget about it, but then bring it back now to kind of start leading into that part of the storyline. And this is kind of a subplot that's going to be worked in, but it is going to be important to the main plot line as well, because it kind of provides, it's kind of a trigger for a couple different things that I'll get into. So I needed to bring back Seville in this chapter. And I actually went with, I don't actually bring her back in, like she's not in class that day, but she comes back up as a topic of conversation as Penelope and Riss are chatting and kind of, just sharing some like high school gossip. And Riss brings up Seville and mentions like, she's like, oh, did you hear that Eric asked her to go to the bonfire this weekend? And they have a little bit of discussion of like, oh, yeah, like I assume you can't go to the bonfire. And, no, obviously Penelope's parents are not going to let her go to a weekend bonfire with a bunch of teenagers and get into trouble. That's well outside the bounds of what they would think was appropriate. So the conversation kind of starts like that, like, oh, wouldn't it be nice if your parents weren't like so crazy and you could come to these, fairly normal teenagey things. And then the topic of Seville comes up. And then this is where we also get the introduction to Eric. And again, I don't really identify who Eric is, whether he has any other connection other than just he's part of their, not friend circle, but like their awareness of him within the community of this high school. And they kind of chat a little bit about what a not very nice guy Eric is and some of his previous experiences with young women that they know from school, and like how he has kind of somehow slipped out of facing any criminal charges because of the way that he has treated some of his previous girlfriends and dates. So kind of bringing back, I've already established in chapter 2 that Seville is not a very nice person. She treats everyone like crap. She's very bitchy and just not great. No one really likes her. So they're not really all that sympathetic to the fact that this guy, Eric, who is also, they're not a big fan of him and how he treats people. And they're kind of a little bit of dark humor in just joking about like, oh, well, they're quite the pair. And she wasn't in class that day. And Penelope kind of makes a comment of like, oh, she must be getting some extra beauty sleep to prepare for her encounter with Eric and whatever damage he might do to her. So like I said, like I don't actually bring Seville back into the chapter, but I remind the readers of the interaction that Penelope witnessed in chapter 2 with her being awful to the teacher. And maybe not. We'll see when I get this out to beta readers, like if they remember at that point the text that Penelope had sent, and if they start to make some connections. And I think it's fine if readers don't immediately like pull that piece of information back up and connect it. I will remind them of it more specifically later when that text thread comes back up. So I'm okay if it's kind of like, oh yeah, I remember that like Seville girl who is awful. But if they don't remember the text at this point, I'm okay with that because they will get a reminder later and it will come into play more. But I didn't want them to completely forget about Seville. And I did need to introduce this Eric character because those who have listened to the previous episodes, Eric is actually Arya's brother, but in this new version of the story, the reader won't know this at that point. He's just some other kid in the community, and he's already graduated from high school. He is older than Penelope in her circle, but he's one of those that is kind of like, dude, like, why are you still hanging out at high school events? What's your deal? Like, why aren't you moving on and progressing into like adulthood? He seems to be one of those who's like still stuck on, trying to get invited to prom and showing up at these activities and dating the high school girls instead of kind of taking that next step of like, well, he's not in college, but even not like, making a new circle of friends or staying connected with people who've left high school. He's his maturity level and impulse control and things like that attached to high school at this point. And he's got a pretty unstable background as far as how he has treated other people. And another challenge that I faced with this section of the chapter, I did have to go back and reread because I couldn't remember what I had actually said previously about Riss's awareness, what Penelope has experienced with her family, like her knowledge of the abuse that she experiences. Because if it's been a little while, a couple episodes ago, but chapter 7 of the Not Karmic story ended with Penelope getting home late from her, fake study group and getting beaten up pretty badly by her dad and getting like no help, no support from them. So she is in a lot of pain this morning as she shows up to school, and her mom drives her to school. She's kind of locked down. She's grounded. The keys to her car have been taken away. So she's having to rely on being picked up and dropped off. So Riss immediately she texts Riss and says like, hey, like my mom's dropping me off. So Riss immediately knows something has happened. She's grounded. Her privileges has been taken away. But I couldn't remember if I had said anything about Riss knowing about physical abuse. And when I went back and read that, I had painted it earlier as like she suspects, and like kind of in that teenage way of like, something is going on, but you don't have like 100% evidence, and you don't have that confidence to go tell an adult, because if your friend is dealing with it and they say it's okay and that they're, that they don't want anyone stepping in, that friend often won't speak up because they're afraid of the consequences to the friend. Protective services won't do enough, that they won't take it serious. There's a lot of fear there with kids who experience abuse often, from what I have read and researched, and that it's very hard for a friend, even when they know what's going on or they heavily suspect that someone is being mistreated. It's very hard to actually speak up and confront that because they're, in many cases, afraid that their friend will be further harmed because of that, or the friend will be removed from the situation and then they won't see them. Like, there's a lot of factors that go into it. And so I wanted this to be realistic about how Riss would handle this if she does have some partial or full knowledge that Penelope is being physically abused by her parents. How would she deal with that? And so kind of where I have it right now is that, yes, she's noticed the signs. She sees when Penelope is extra careful physically and that she moves and walks different, but they haven't outright discussed it. She hasn't confronted Penelope with it. She knows her parents are super strict and harsh, and she suspects this physical abuse, but because Penelope has never confided in her directly and brought it up, and Penelope seems to be like dealing with it and getting through it and has some sort of like plan or strategies, she kind of just is trusting that Penelope is doing what she thinks is best, and she's not confident enough to, go to her parents or go to someone at school and say, my friend is being, beat up by her parents. And I'll run that by some beta readers, but Chris particularly, just to get his thoughts, because he's really helpful with kind of judging the realistic responses of people, particularly, in areas like this. I'll likely revise that and just, kind of work with that after I get some feedback and a little bit more research into what would be her realistic response to that. So in this situation, they're kind of skirting around the fact that Penelope is obviously in pain, and that kind of leads into a little bit more of the dark humor of them kind of poking fun at Seville, who they don't like and think is awful, and this Eric guy who has a reputation for being, to put it mildly, overly aggressive with his dates. To be frank about it, like he has hit people and he has mistreated and abused previous girlfriends, but he's always managed to kind of escape the consequences so far. And kind of bringing those two situations together to see how these two teenage girls are kind of processing and dealing with those darker ideas of things that happen around them that they can't really do anything about, or that they feel powerless in it being in the middle of or being near. And so, they kind of lean toward a little bit of humor and karma in that sense of like, well, she's kind of a nasty, horrible person. So are we really going to feel that bad about her if this Eric guy, gets a little rough with her? And like, really they do. Like, they don't want to see that happen to people, but in that way that humans tend to, make light of dark and scary things. We're seeing that with them. And I think particularly because of Riss's feeling that she can't do anything about any of it. She sees that her friend is hurting. She wishes it was different, but she feels like she just needs to stay on the sideline and be supportive. So, yeah, we'll see how that plays with readers and see if I need to make some adjustments as I go. Because at this point, like, I feel like it read the way I wanted it to, but sometimes that's really hard to tell. I'll just have to see what other people think and see if what I intended is how it came across and fix it if not. So yeah, like I said, the readers don't know who Eric is at this point, but I want to be dropping hints through this about who he is and what kind of person he is, so that when that connection is made, it will add another layer of depth to understanding Arya's family life and where things sit for her. So I'm hoping for kind of when that reveal comes for readers to be like, oh, okay, this is connecting, this is making more sense at that point. But as of right now in this chapter, the reader will just kind of be like, who is this guy? He seems awful. What's going to happen between these two people? So we'll see. I'm still trying to figure out like how I'm going to bring those consequences and those events in. Whether I don't think I want to. No, I don't think Penelope would not take the risk to sneak out just for a high school bonfire. That would be beyond her threshold of putting herself and her siblings at risk. She will sneak out at other times, and I'll deal with that separately. But this wouldn't be something that she would be willing to take the risk, because she's so close to her birthday and her plans all coming together that this would be a really silly thing for her to risk that for. And I think it would be out of her character. So I'm going to have to deal with the outcome of Eric and Seville striking up a relationship through risk or through gossip, different things like that, which will be a little bit challenging because I'm going to have to avoid that reader response that I sometimes get when I read something where I'm like, why wasn't the character there? Why didn't I get to see this firsthand? That would have been better, but it wouldn't make sense. It would be really kind of forcing things as the author to put Penelope at that event when it wouldn't make sense for her to take that risk. So I've still got to think a little bit about how I'm going to bring that back in an effective way to see Penelope's reaction and to further that storyline a little bit more. So that'll be in the back of my mind. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to pull that off yet, but it's in my thoughts and I'll be working on that. And the last thing in this book, in this chapter, we're back in Mrs. Harbor's class and see her kind of trying to navigate her school day while in a lot of pain and having to be really careful to hide that from people, especially in Mrs. Harbor's class, where she is a teacher who pays attention and might notice. So Penelope kind of has an interaction with a classmate sitting next to her, kind of a shy boy who is surprised when she's like, hey, can you grab the book for me? Because she doesn't want to get back up and have to deal with the pain of moving around. And so I'm trying to, I'll probably bring him in a few more times, maybe use him for a little bit of information or something along the way. But he's not going to be any major character as far as I see so far. But I may find some uses for him moving forward, because he's kind of like, oh my gosh, she talked to me. And, kind of like that. So we'll see what I do with that character. But mostly the focus of the last part of the chapter was her going back to this final essay that she needs to write for her English class. And going back to that earlier chapter where she had chosen a theme from Anna Karenina that she now needs to expand on and explain in this essay. And I went with Anna Karenina because it's one of those books I did not particularly enjoy. I found it just like kind of torturous to read, but I do get why it's a classic and why people go back to it. And I get the usual kind of analysis and explanation of it. And it's one that I kind of feel like usually when people talk about Anna Karenina, when I read it, I was like, that's not the message I took away from it. I saw their whole relationship differently than what I've seen in like normally in normal literary analysis of the book. And so I'm kind of using everything that Penelope has been through to kind of take a different perspective on this book than what most people kind of take away from it. And usually that lesson is something along the line of, when you live like selfishly and recklessly, it kind of destroys everybody's lives. But again, like I said, like that's not necessarily how I read it. And I think it really depends on like your life experiences that you bring into a book that really affects what you take away from it. And so Penelope, thinking about her and everything that she's lived through and how she would interpret this book, she wouldn't see it the same way of just like this, reckless decision making, because she does see why the characters made the choices that she did. And she agrees with some of it and she disagrees with some of it. She values safety and stability, which is what Anna had in her original marriage. It was fine. It wasn't based on love. It wasn't exciting. It wasn't, anything other than like a decent match for her to have made. She doesn't enjoy her life or anything like that. But it is safe and stable until Vronsky comes into the picture. And, all of a sudden then she's experiencing this passion and this excitement and she wants that. It's so foreign to her that it's really intoxicating, and she is kind of willing to blow up her life to have this passion and excitement. And, like I said, like normal interpretations of that are, looking at Anna and Vronsky as these reckless, selfish characters who destroy all of their lives by the end, and no one is happy and no one got what they want, and it's just kind of misery all around. But Penelope has this kind of like battle as she thinks about this story that yes, safety and stability, like those are so important to her. That's what she's working towards, what she's trying to get for her siblings. But she does also understand that need to live life like outside of the box that someone else makes for you, because this is what her parents have done to her. They have created this hyper-conservative, walled-off life that they expect all their children to live and abide by and follow all the rules and do everything that they're told to do. And she can't help but rebel against that and want something different and want to be who she really is deep down. So she's got this battle of how she looks at these characters and these competing, deep down, desperate needs that she has in her own life, and trying to figure out how to communicate all of that in this last essay. And I'm not totally sure. This actually wasn't something I was planning on integrating at all. It just, when she was in the classroom setting in chapter 2, I was just kind of like filling out the world that, she wouldn't just be sitting there aimlessly in the class, although there are plenty of teachers who do that. But in this case, like she would be actively doing something in this class. And so I needed her to be, working on something. And it's like, well, okay, well, bring in what would she be doing in her last level of English class and putting together kind of this final project. And so I'm not sure like how much I'll really integrate this essay and her thoughts in. Part of that is I absolutely do not want to reread or re-listen to Anna Karenina because it was really long. And like I said, it was a bit of a slog for me to get through it. So I definitely don't want to have to re-listen to it to make this like a prominent part of the book. But I am looking stuff up and kind of refreshing my mind about it. Because I also don't want to, like, anybody who hasn't read Anna Karenina, which is probably a lot of people, I don't think it's like, it's taught very much. It's not in a lot of curriculum. It's probably not one that a lot of people are familiar with. So I don't want to make it feel like something that the reader has to like go do research on to understand this part of the story. So I'm trying to give the reader enough details about the story of Anna Karenina that they can make some connections without it being, a long, boring explanation of the story and why it has anything to do with anything. So I think I will likely kind of keep it in the background, but bring it up as ways to help show that internal struggle that Penelope is facing. And honestly, to kind of give those little bits of hints, like I said, in the story in Anna Karenina, nobody wins. Everybody is miserable by the end of the book. And so it is one that kind of gives some hints to the reader of the direction that Penelope, especially in her relationship with Arya, where that is currently pointed and how that might go if everything stays the same and if they continue to make the same decisions that they are. Although the roles are kind of reversed, because, in Anna Karenina, she's the one who really kind of instigates a lot of things and sets them on the path that they go, while Vronsky, the person she has the affair with and eventually ends up, is a little bit unwitting in all of this and kind of gets caught up in things that he didn't exactly intend to be in the middle of. And the roles are a bit reversed in this because Arya is the one who is driving their relationship in the direction it's going. And Penelope has intense feelings for Arya, but they're very complicated because of everything else she's been through and because of her need to escape her current situation. So kind of using it again as a way to show Penelope's perspective and worldview, but also to give these hints to the reader about where things might go should they follow the same path. And that's kind of where I ended that chapter, was kind of some rumination, I guess, on her writing this essay and giving Penelope a chance to kind of show some of the internal battle that she's facing with this particular side of things. And then I was kind of, again, I kind of hit that wall of, where do I go from here now? What's the next step? I kind of just set it aside for a minute, trying to think about where I was going to go next, because partly I need to move this along. I'm still only on, like chapters 1 through 8 have all been about a day and a half in the story timeline. And I kind of set the minimum of 24-day timeline at the beginning as she's like counting down to her birthday and turning 18. And so I was kind of looking at that because I started just mapping out the days so I knew where they were. So I wasn't, creating any timeline conflicts. And then I was like, oh, geez, like we're only on day 2. So I need to think about ways that we're kind of like going to get things moving and where there may be some time to like skip ahead. But I didn't quite know where to go. So I stopped at that point and kind of moved back to the karmic story, because as I was working on chapter 8 for this one, I kind of had the thought of, first, a few things that I needed to go back and fix in the karmic story, and a direction of where I wanted to go, because I'd kind of stopped there with the baby puppies getting dropped on them and needing to keep them for at least about 24 hours, or a little bit less, because they're going to hand them back over sometime in the evening or late afternoon. So we've got the puppies, and I kind of knew she was going to need to take them to work with her. And so that was going to kind of bind them to staying at work for this chapter. And so again, I was kind of like, well, how do I keep this interesting? How do I not just have this be a boring day sitting at work with various coworkers popping in to play with the puppies? And I still wasn't quite sure, but I was also stuck on the not karmic one. So I was like, well, I'll go back to karmic and just see how far I get. So this one, it's on chapter 7, and I started writing the first part to show them getting ready and kind of the effects of being up every 2 hours with these puppies, and that being a complication that Beatrix is trying to deal with, because with her being in control of Katie's body, she's the one who experiences the physical side effects of whatever they're doing. Katie is kind of detached in that sense. So Katie is, they get up in the morning and she's bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, no problem, no exhaustion. Whereas Beatrix is super tired and cranky and kind of put out, even though she adores the puppies. And as I said in the last one, like the karmic people kind of have a deep fondness for pets because they don't have anything like that on their world. But she is like sleep deprived and grumpy and frustrated that once again, like they made no progress on anything overnight because, they're taking care of the puppies and being interrupted constantly, not getting any sleep. So I go back to that section and kind of just get like the very first part. Like it was probably maybe, I don't know, like 500 words or something. Not a ton. Just an interaction between Beatrix and Katie as they're trying to get all of the puppies ready and all of their supplies and everything like that. And so showing the tiredness, the frustration, the interaction in between those two. And as I was working on that, some vocabulary stuff came up, and I had written, Katie is bugging Beatrix and annoying the crap out of her with like reminders and like, do this, do this, do this. And she's like slogging through, super tired, trying to get stuff ready. And she finally kind of like snaps back at her and is just like, if you tell me one more time not to forget the bottle warmer, I am going to wrap you up in a soul pod and keep you there. And she's like, oh, what's that? And she explains, kind of the idea I had in the original version of this, where when the agent takes over a body, they collect the original human's energy and like basically wrap it up in a ball and keep them there. So she kind of threatens Katie with this because she's just tired and irritated. And then I was kind of just like, soul pod, like that sounds really stupid. I didn't like the terminology. So I thought about that for a while as I was kind of working on that section of the chapter. And eventually I went back. So I was like, pod doesn't sound like appropriate for what the use for it would be. So I changed it to soul trap because a trap is more something that like you're trying to contain something and hold it there. And that seemed more appropriate for the point. And then that kind of led into a discussion of what the usual response of a human is when a karmic agent takes over their body. And that most of the time they're not real happy about it. They fight back, and many of the people end up having to be put in these soul traps so that the agent can just do what they need to do without having to fight a human consciousness the whole time. And Katie is intrigued by this because she's like surprised that more people would not want to help and be involved in the investigation and help solve the mystery and benefit people. And so again, it was kind of just showing like how different she is from the average human in many ways. And that will feed into later when they start kind of figuring out that even though Katie is not the target exactly, she is very much tied to this disturbance. It's just different than how they've seen it before, which then is kind of going to signal to the reader for a series story arc of kind of a shift in the chaotic agents and how they're attempting to influence the Earth dimension and humanity overall. So again, kind of just like laying in those little teeny hints that will build over time, and hopefully they're not too tiny that they get missed, but those are kind of in my mind as I'm trying to put little bits and pieces in here and there. So I wrote that section of chapter 7 for this one of trying to get them ready to go and off to work. And I kind of left it at that point, kind of a scene break there, because I didn't know what they were going to do when they got to work. And again, like I didn't want just like a boring sit at her desk, work and feed puppies and blah, blah, back and forth, back and forth. So I didn't really want to move forward with the chapter because I didn't know what else to do with it. So that's kind of as far as I got there of just that little introduction to chapter 7. And then I left it and kind of put a pause on writing because I didn't know where to go with either of the story. So I went out to work on the trees. I've still got like branches all over my yard and trying to cut them down and put them in 8 million piles around the place and do all of that. It's kind of a good activity for thinking and helps me just kind of like process stuff in the background, which was kind of where I was in my headspace at that time. Like I just needed to process while listening to podcasts and audiobooks. And the next book in the Dungeon Crawler Carl series, that's a really good one because it's funny and like not distracting isn't the right word, but it like occupies my mind, but in a way that still lets like the thoughts in the back of my mind keep processing out. So I did that for a bit, worked on the trees and just kind of other things like that to think about both books. And rather than going back to chapter 7, because I still didn't really know what to do with it, I kind of had a new idea for the not karmic story for chapter 9 and where I wanted it to go next. And as I mentioned, like I do need to start moving the story forward a little bit more in the timeline to get her to her birthday. But the thought that I had is still within that day 2 of the timeline. And what I wanted to do after having shown her getting beat up by her parents, and then in chapter 8, showing her perspective and worldview and having that conversation with Riss, I felt like I needed to show Penelope, to show some of her strength in standing up to something and also to show like her hitting a limit without really like planning to kind of drawing on this strength that she generally keeps hidden. You know, to everybody else, she's calm, she's quiet, she's compliant, she works hard and keeps her head down, and that's it. She tries to stay off of people's radar in all situations outside of, you know, when her and Arya go out to find Marks. But I felt like I needed to show another side of her at this point to show the reader that even though most of the time, like she has control, she has things very planned out, she knows what she needs to do, kind of leaning back to those first moments in chapter 1 where she kind of bites back at her mom when she's like screaming at her through the door to get up, that she does have these moments where she loses control on some level just to kind of humanize her. Because I was like a little bit worried that like she's too good at what she has learned to do to cope and strategize on getting through this. I want to keep her realistic, and realistically, she's gonna slip up here and there, and she's gonna react rather than make an intentional choice. And so I thought the best way to do that was an interaction with Kendall, because I think I've already established, for the most part, that readers are not going to be in love with Kendall. He's whiny, he's irritating, he's immature, he doesn't care about her needs. And at first I had kind of planned to keep him throughout the book, but I also thought like that doesn't necessarily make sense. She's on this timeline. She's got less, about 3 weeks to graduation and then her birthday. And Kendall as like a cover story is really not working with her family. Like her mom knows that she's not actually into guys. And then her mom thinking that despite all of that, like she's still sleeping with Kendall, that like him as a cover has fallen apart at this point. It's causing more conflict than she originally thought it would. And things around her as far as like with her parents after the abuse. And then Kendall comes in whining and being a crybaby about how it all affected him. And it's just more than she can take in that moment. So I opened chapter 9 with her at lunch. And Riss does not have the same lunch hour as her, so it's just her and Kendall, and she's already gotten her seat and sat down, and Kendall shows up in the lunchroom and is immediately just complaining. Can't believe you got yourself grounded again. I think you did it on purpose because you didn't want to hang out on Thursday. Blah, 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 blah. Like every word out of his mouth is just like another pinprick in her. And, you can only do that so much before someone just blows up at you. And so she can't really hold her tongue in this situation. She's in physical pain. She's still like just really raw from not just the abuse of her parents, but just like the treatment and the things that they said. And she just, she just can't take it. And so she kind of talks back to him which sets him off and makes him, just be even more of a childish baby. And it kind of starts drawing attention from the other people in the lunchroom. And she's not someone with like a lot of friends, so nobody's gonna like get up and rush to her aid. And honestly, like for the most part, like teenagers don't do that very often. They'll take out their phone and start recording it instead. But they're kind of getting attention, and there's part of Penelope where she's like, I need to like de-escalate this. But then again, like she can't really do the things that she would usually do in that moment. She's just too much on the edge after everything she's been through in the last 24 hours. So Kendall's being awful. She reacts to him. He takes it up a notch. She says something back. And someone nearby does kind of like verbally say like to Kendall, like, dude, like, what the heck? Calm down or whatever. And he doesn't. And so when she kind of says something back to him, he reaches for her to like grab her. And by that point, they've attracted enough attention that the admin who are monitoring the lunchroom, one of them calls out to Kendall and kind of is like, in my office. Like, now we're not going to put up with that, because they see it, heading in a direction where he's about to get physical with her. So Kendall gets pulled out of the situation. And at first, Penelope is just kind of like, oh, thank goodness, like he's gone. But then another admin shows up. And oh, I think I forgot to say, like the last thing that kind of sets Kendall off is Penelope just saying like, fine, we're done. Like, get away from me. I don't, like, we're over. And so that's what he reacts to and freaks out, because he's just like, oh no, he's a childish baby and someone's trying to take something away from him. So he responds to that inappropriately. Gets called out, gets, not literally dragged off, but verbally dragged off to go talk to admin. And then a female admin is also there, and she kind of witnessed what was going on and takes like a nicer approach and asks Penelope if she wants to come eat her lunch in her office. And like normally this is something that Penelope would shy away from, to be in close with someone in authority who could see some signs, who is a mandatory reporter. But she's also a bit more fragile than usual, and she needs a moment and she needs somewhere safe to just sit and kind of process. So kind of out of her usual decision making, she goes with this female admin. I think I named her Mrs. Prescott. Goes with her to her office. And at first just kind of, they just sit there, they're quietly eating, chit-chatting about inconsequential things. She gives her some space to kind of calm down and process before asking about what just happened with Kendall. And part of that, why I brought the second admin in, is I think when I originally thought, like, I'm going to have them get into a verbal argument and Penelope's going to lose it and just like break up with him and just be like, this is not worth it anymore. What am I even doing? Honestly, in my head, I was like, well, that's a whole chapter. And then it wasn't. It was maybe like a third of a chapter, which was fine, because it would have been weird to try to drag it out longer. And it would have been unrealistic too, to have them like get into a major, screaming match or scuffle or anything in the middle of school, where I assume that most other high schools are like the one that I work out, where there are monitors of some sort, whether that's teacher or admin or security, in the lunch area, looking out for this kind of stuff, because this is when kids are going to be especially stupid. So it wouldn't be realistic for this to be a long, dragged out argument. And like they would step in the second it even looked like it might get physical or attracted too much attention. So realistically, like this just wouldn't be a very long scene, because someone would step in. So it did end up being kind of shorter than I initially pictured it. But when I read back through it, I was like, no, like I think this is realistic on how this would have gone and how short it would have been. So I didn't want to add to it and try to like force it to be longer than it was, which made me think like, okay, what would be the realistic consequence of a kid making an aggressive move toward another person after like a verbal altercation had already been witnessed? Well, they would step in. Admin would do something, or, CSMs or whoever, the security people. Like someone would step in and separate, and then there would be like some discussion. So, if Kendall's going to be taken off, like they're not just going to leave Penelope sitting there and be like, great, you're fine now. Let's move on. Someone would want to at least like check in on her. So I have this female admin who steps in to do that. And, it's not a big like pressure situation of like, okay, we're going to fill out a report. Tell me everything. She just takes it very calmly, friendly, just trying to establish a rapport first, really, before kind of easing into giving her some information about, signs of unhealthy relationships. And she kind of gives her a pamphlet that I was like, honestly, I don't know how many like pamphlets are still handed out, but like it's got a website, it's got, online resources as well, but it's something that she can hand her. And this is something too that I wanted to put in here to be referenced later. Because, like, honestly, Penelope knows that her relationship with Kendall is unhealthy. It's completely based on lies, her lies, that she likes men and that she cared about him, that she wanted to be in a relationship. All of that is completely fabricated. She was using him and she recognizes that. She knows that, like, this is not a good relationship because, like, how could it be? She fabricated it to protect herself. She has never been attracted to or even really cared about Kendall. And so she knows that. So she doesn't need anything to help her recognize that what she has with Kendall is not a good relationship. She knows that. She set that up to begin with. But I do want it to be in her mind and to maybe like, she finds it in her backpack later or something. Something from this is going to stick with her either physically or just, in her thoughts to later have her recognize some of what's going on between her and Arya ticks those boxes and is not good for her. Because in her mind, like right now, like she sees Arya as like the only person who understands her, someone who supports her, someone who's helping her on her like goals for getting away from her parents and rescuing her siblings. And like yeah, sure, she sees some things about Arya that she doesn't love, but she just kind of chalks it up as, nobody's perfect. Everybody has their flaws. But, in her eyes, like Arya has really like saved her in so many ways. She's taught her the ropes of, this quote unquote side business they have. And, she listens, she's supportive. She sees her feelings as very genuine, that she's loved and accepted by Arya. And it's going to take a lot for her to recognize that what she has with Arya is way worse than the relationship she has with Kendall. Like, it is super unhealthy. But her example of relationships, comes from her parents. So she does not recognize the problems with her relationships with Arya. So I'm not sure, like I said, like how I'm going to use this pamphlet in this conversation later, but it is planting a seed to come back into the story at some point, whether like she physically finds it or something reminds her of this conversation that comes up later. And then the other thing with Arya in this chapter is that when admin steps in to separate Penelope and Kendall, and the admin, Miss Prescott, invites her to, come eat her lunch elsewhere so she's not being stared at the whole time. She gets up to follow Miss Prescott, and everybody's kind of staring at her and like, oh, what the heck? And she sees Arya's face in the crowd. And this is the first acknowledgement to the reader that Arya actually goes to school with her. They are both seniors at this high school, but they have zero contact at school. The only thing they get here, the readers, is I describe Arya's facial expression and that she is like very upset and angry in that moment, but she does nothing. She just stands there and watches her walk away. And so hopefully with that, like I'm kind of communicating to the reader that like there is way more to this relationship than they've been told so far, the readers, and that there are some real weird boundaries going on. And like, why are there those boundaries? Like, yes, obviously, her parents freak out over, her being lesbian. So clearly they would not be carrying on a relationship at school where anyone else would know about that. Plus, she's been using Kendall as like her shield, pretending to be straight. But like they're not friends. There is no nothing at school. And like nobody else at school would have any idea that they have any connection to each other whatsoever. the why I'm going to leave at this point for the reader to be thinking about. But I did want to, at this point, like establish the fact that there is way more between these two than I've explained so far. And then that's going to come back up later. It's one of those pieces of the puzzle that hopefully will start connecting the further we get into the story, to let readers put things together without me having to just directly come out and say, and by now you should have figured this out. Because that's really kind of condescending. And like I generally know, like I said, it's like I don't always know it perfectly. So then I get feedback and I'm like, oh, well, I thought I did this, but apparently that didn't come across. But generally, like I know that the person who's going to be reading this is going to be someone who is going to make connections and be kind of keeping a tally of things in their head to piece together stuff. Because even though like I wouldn't call this a mystery, this is more of like a dark family drama, but there are elements that the reader needs to put together to fully understand why all of this is happening. And so hopefully that is another piece of that puzzle that they can kind of tuck away and save for later as they figure things out. And so I wrap this chapter up with, I've dropped these couple of seeds here and there, and a lot of this is going to come back up later. But I also use this as an opportunity to show kind of, again, here's one more person that as things start going really crazy, there is someone here at school, there's another trusted adult who would be willing to help, but will Penelope take that step to ask for help? And leave that question in the reader's mind. Because I want to make it clear, like there are options for for Penelope to try to get help from some of these adults in her life who would be willing to do it, but leaving that up in the air, will she, won't she, and how is that going to impact the ending of the story? So that's kind of where I stopped working on the not karmic side of things at this point. And I think I'm going to kind of wrap up day 2 there. I'm not really going to have any interaction with her parents. They're all kind of just like, I think for the next little bit, freezing each other out. Like they're going to be in the same spaces, but everybody is just kind of avoiding each other, keeping it quiet, trying to avoid provoking each other at this point. So I'm going to think on where this is going to pick back up. I'd set up earlier that I'll have to look back because I can't actually remember if I said it was Friday night or Saturday, but there's this kind of like bonfire event for the seniors particularly. Usually, there's kind of various events for seniors throughout the year to really celebrate them finishing up and moving on and things. So actually I need to look back and see what day that was, because I'm kind of thinking this might be an opportunity as things are like staying as low-key as possible at home. That might be the next point where I want to pick things up, but I'm not sure how. Because like I said, Penelope is not going to be at the bonfire, but there's going to be consequences from that she needs to know about. And I'm still trying to decide like how to make that work without it just being like, did you hear about this? Blah, 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 blah. And then a long conversation. So we'll see. I'll let that like ruminate a little bit more. And so, yeah, to kind of wrap up this episode, once I finished up chapter 9, I let that settle for a bit. And while I was working on that and just, doing more trees and branches and various other things around the house, I had the thought that one way to go back to the karmic story, we've got the puppies at the office. They're kind of stuck there. They're a little bit stationary. And like the puppies themselves being at the office, not an uncommon thing. Like I said, Katie does this sort of thing fairly often. Her boss is used to that. And I was trying to think, what would be the next thing that would kind of disrupt what they're doing, which I feel like is kind of a theme with this karmic storyline, is just looking for these continual disruptions. And not to like drag it out, but like what would be the realistic disruptions to Beatrix trying to solve this mystery and figure out what the heck is going on. And part of that, like she's in a human body, she's stuck in their life. So their life is going to complicate things because she can't just stop everything and go on an investigation. She's still got to work around the day-to-day stuff. Otherwise, she can introduce chaos into the disturbance through disrupting what's going on. So because like her goal is to reestablish balance with the situation, she's really got to work to stay on track with the human's life as much as possible to not make things worse. Because the more chaos she causes, she's actually doing the opposite, and that can add to the disturbance, even though, she's not a chaotic agent, that's still going to be a problem. So I was thinking, like, what would be the fallout of everything that had happened the day before with saving Mr. Padilla, having the puppies? What would happen? And partly because, I don't know, where I live, there's a couple community groups, and it's like you find out more about what's going on around town, usually the bad, but sometimes the good as well, because people will jump online and post stuff, whether it's an angry rant or there was an accident or, hey, this weird thing happened in my neighborhood, stuff like that. So that there's been a lot of that lately. So that was on my mind. And I thought, okay, but what about like an older couple who's not necessarily, going to go on a Facebook community group to post anything, but maybe who still want to recognize that, in their mind, Katie did something worth recognizing. And, being that they're kind of an older generation, even their children that Katie and Beatrix met at the hospital, the Padillas that they saved are, I can't remember what I said, but like late 80s, 90s, like they're old. So their kids are also older and maybe less likely to go on Facebook. But who would you go to? You would go to the community leaders. So they wanted to recognize that Katie had done this great thing of saving their dad. So they actually call like the mayor, and then they find out the number for where Katie works. And so they call several people within the government to just like be grateful that Katie did this thing and, saved their dad. And so then I kind of following that train of thought, like, where would that lead to? And the fact that Katie had to be kind of like, a little vague and kind of stretch the truth a bit and of why she was there and how she ended up interacting with them. So it kind of, the information gets a bit muddled. And when I come back from the scene break, where I stopped before, one of Katie's coworkers is sitting on the floor playing with the puppies, and her boss walks in and sees the puppy, sees the coworker, and is just like, oh gosh, okay, whatever. He said like he's used to Katie and kind of her eccentric hobbies and interests that occasionally overlap with work. So he kind of just ignores that and then goes right into like, okay, can you explain how exactly you managed to save some old guy the other day? And again, she kind of has to, and this is Beatrix talking, like she kind of has to lie and be like, oh, well, friend of a neighbor, and they were having some weird issues with their billing, and it was on my way back to work yesterday, so I stopped, and like, just crazy that it was at the right time. And he's kind of like, okay, yeah, like he'd gotten something similar. And so he says basically that the mayor was also called about this, and now the mayor is super curious about this new program that they have about customer outreach and fixing these problems on a personal level. And he's just like, what the heck? Like, did you start some weird thing you didn't even tell me about? And now I've got to keep track of it. And what the heck? He's kind of irritated with the whole thing, but he's also like, well, I'm going to dump this on you if you're responsible for starting whatever the heck this thing is. And it's a disruption, but Beatrix also quickly recognizes that this could be exactly what they need, because this is now a reason to go out into the community and get into people's homes and talk to them and get more information. So she, surprisingly to Katie, who is, listening in on all of this, is like on board right away. And her boss is like, they want data at the next city council meeting. Like, this isn't even a real program. How are we supposed to get this? And so Beatrix is just like, no problem. I got this, which does feel like Katie, because that is how she would respond, which surprises Katie and all of that. But this really kind of like perks her up and is like, oh, this is going to be good. Like, I can actually use this disruption to our benefit, which funnily enough kind of like puts Katie out a little bit. She's like, wait, I'm going to have to like keep doing this once you leave. Like, this is a whole new thing on my plate. And Beatrice is just like, well, too bad. We're doing it. And as I was going through this, this kind of cement, like for the next, at least probably couple of chapters, this is going to give me some action, some movement in the story. It's going to give them a reason to believably be out in the community to gather this and get out of the office, because I did need them out of the office, but I wanted it to be for a reason that would make sense without Katie just being like, hey, I need to take a couple days off. See ya. So even though this conversation doesn't necessarily have action, it does introduce a new character. It gives me a path to move forward over the next couple of chapters. And it did give Beatrix a little bit of time to kind of process what they found so far. And that's kind of like right at the end of the chapter. She's noticing some weird things with the data as far as like where the people are located, but she still can't pinpoint why that might be important. So I leave that question for the reader. Like, yes, she's noticing there seems to be a difference in where some of these events are happening. There is city water, and then there's irrigation water and canals and stuff like that. And she's noticed that none of this seems to be happening around where the irrigation canals are, because this was originally a farming community. So they've kind of got this mix of city services, but agricultural services as well. And she's noted that, but she doesn't know what to do with it because it doesn't actually make any sense. And it's not part of Katie's system that she has any information or control over. That's managed by someone else. So it's given me a path to move forward, which is good. And I've kind of got some ideas of where I'm going next as far as with the karmic story. So that'll probably be the next chapter I work on and have an update for. Not totally sure like the exact next steps, but like who she's going to talk to and what information she's going to give. So I'm going to think on that. And then I did, like, as I was working on this, there were a couple of things that I added in as I was finishing up this chapter that actually caused me to need to go back and fix some other stuff. I had mentioned earlier in the first part of chapter 7 that Katie was annoying Beatrix because she kept having to remind her of things and give her direction because she was tired and forgetful. And after I finished this one, I kind of went back and reread the early part of chapter 7 to make sure that there wasn't anything I had put in earlier that I didn't follow up on. And I realized I had put in those comments in the first part of the chapter of like, don't forget the bottle warmer. And that's what kind of makes Beatrix get annoyed with her and be like, shut up or I'm going to put you in the soul trap. And then I went back and looked at it and I was like, then I never went back and followed up on that because Katie was supposed to forget the bottle warmer. So I forgot about it myself as I was writing. And so I went back and added that in. And as I was rereading that first part of the chapter, I was kind of like, oh, this is kind of slow and not a whole lot happens. There's like a brief mention of how like it's kind of awkward trying to, like, she's got the puppies in the kennel and she sets them on the passenger seat next to her. And she's like, oh, I'm going to have to drive one-handed to make sure that the kennel stays put because people in this town kind of drive crazy. And I was like, I wrote that in and I was like, did I actually ever really address that earlier? In my head, this has been a part of the town, probably because, like I said, where I live, people drive crazy and it's a constant frustration to me that you have to be super defensive here because people just drive like lunatics half the time. And so I was like, oh, yeah, I don't think I ever actually like addressed that. Like she makes the comment here, but there's nothing leading up to that. So I actually rewrote a section of the early part of chapter 7 to delve into the crazy driving of this town and how that causes issues. Because in my mind, I actually had some thoughts about how that would impact things later in the story. But I realized here, I never actually established that this is a feature of the town. There's just a lot of crazy driving. So I added it here to the beginning of chapter 7. And then I actually went back to, what is it, like chapter 2 or 3? 3 maybe? I think it's chapter 3. When they're racing to the Padilla's house to try to save him, I think I had just been like, you know, she gives the directions, they speed through town and they get there. So I actually went back and rewrote that section to add in some complications with the driving of people pulling out in front of her and going 10 miles under the speed limit and not paying attention and her having to dodge stupid drivers as she's trying to get to Mr. Padilla's house. So that was something, because I do want that to kind of come back later and play a role in some of the points during the story. So I think that kind of helps develop a sense of the town a little bit more. And it's something that I can draw on later. Because as I said, like I feel like I'm constantly looking for ways to disrupt their work. For one, just, you know, to keep it interesting. but also just to show like the chaos that they're dealing with. It's not just one disruption. There's a lot of chaotic agents, some of it, completely created by humans because we are just kind of chaotic beings. But I'm realizing I want to show like the varying levels of chaos that complicate the human world. And some of it is, yes, just humans making decisions by themselves to be crazy and do stupid things. But even something as small as that, of like bad driving, that can connect back to the chaotic agents and the little ways that they find to disrupt things and cause problems in places to combat any of the good stuff that might be happening from humans, and how the karmic agents are interacting with that and what they do see and what they don't see. Because the part of the larger story of the series is the development of the different agents and what their goals are and how they're carrying them out. And particularly with the karmic agents, what they're not seeing and what they're largely oblivious to, and why some of these disturbances are bigger and more profound and having issues later on in the series that I want to establish here, at least on a small kind of little subplot level that I want to be able to come back to and draw on later. So that's kind of, just helping me as I go back and review things and make changes and see where I can add stuff in, doing a little bit of revision based on a larger series story plotline that needs to be established here to make sense later. And I'm trying to think about that more than I typically have with some of my other series, where I've run into problems after the fact because I get a good idea in book 3 and then I'm like, well, crap, I never actually, put that in anywhere in the earlier books. So I want to do a little bit more of that here. So I'm having to fix less problems later and toss away good ideas because I didn't think of them early enough. So that's kind of where I'm going to leave this episode. This one is a bit long because I got more writing done, so that was nice. But with all the bouncing back and forth, kind of showing like my ping pong nature of part of this chapter back over here. Oh, I got an idea here. My writing has been a little bit chaotic. And so the story development, I kept all of these chapters together to kind of just show that a lot of the times the ideas just come at random, and the way my mind works, like that's fine with me. It just causes me to bounce back and forth between projects quite a bit, which probably would make other people's head explode, but that's just how my brain processes things, and different things come up at different times. And, it helped me get 3 full chapters written across the 2 projects and has given me some ideas of where to go from here and how to move forward. So that's where I'm going to put a pause on it today. I will hopefully get some more writing done this next week to have some more updates for you. But if you are curious about some of my other projects that are done and out there in the world, you can find me at delcheriespinner.com. You can find me on socials. Just search Delcherie. I'm pretty easy to find. And if you are finding this interesting or just enjoying listening to my chaotic rambling, reading and reviewing the podcast does help, and help share it with other people. So that's always appreciated. Or if you want to connect or send me a message through my website or find me on socials, it's always helpful to hear from readers and just hear a little bit more about other people's processes. It's one of my favorite parts of doing the other show that I do, Right on Four Corners, is getting to hear just about how people get through this crazy process of writing coherent stories to share with other people. So those are some of the places that you can find me to connect a little bit more. And I will hopefully be back soon with another update and episode of Writer's Mind. Thank you guys for listening.